bastard! You bastard! You fucking scum! You fucking hate you! We fucking hate you, scum! Animal abusing scum! You're a scumbag!
Look at that sick bastard thinks it's okay to keep puppies in that condition! Fucking scumbag! Animal abusing killers!
I think we are a way of replacing animal use altogether.
And you have to take responsibility for the fact that if this doesn't happen, something else far worse is going to happen, and that's on the people standing against it.
It doesn't even matter one day if I don't even, survive it. But I know it sounds awful, but I'll have died for something I want to do, or for something I love.
They don't deserve to be locked in a cramped cage, separated from their family, eating the same boring meals every day, in a windowless prison, essentially.
Welcome to Camp Beagle. This is the longest running animal rights protest in the UK, and it's based outside a facility called MBR Acres in Cambridgeshire. MBR is owned by Marshall Bioresources, who are an American multinational company that specialise in breeding beagles, and animals that are used in lab tests that can sometimes be used to research for new drugs. Camp Beagle was established outside this facility in July with the intention of shutting them down. They say the beagles bred here are sold to universities and pharmaceutical companies for research where they undergo torturously painful and unnecessary experiments. And with some camp members facing jail time for their activism, I want to find out what motivates the activists who are still living here. My introduction to Camp Beagle begins with an invitation to join their morning meeting where they discuss the challenges facing the camp and how they can bring about the closure of this breeding facility.
So we're going to have a meeting, and Camp Beagle, when we began, didn't we?
It's led by John Curtin, who's become the unofficial camp leader. He's been a well-known figure in the animal rights community for decades. 30 years ago, he broke into the exact facility which Marshall Bioresources now breeds beagles in, although at the time it was operated by another multinational called Interfauna. He took 82 beagles with him and spent 9 months in prison for it.
Anyone want to begin with anything?
The meeting is short, and the topics discussed range from getting supplies to joking about me being an undercover cop. They may have been teasing me, but the camp have reasons to be wary of authorities. Last year, the High Court granted MBR Acres an injunction, creating a 20-metre exclusion zone near the gates to MBR Acres. This prevents the campers from blocking access to the facility. One of the campers, Mikey, is awaiting sentencing after being found guilty of contempt for breaking the injunction. After the meeting is adjourned, I stick around to speak a bit more with Mikey to find out why they want to stop these beagles from being sold to laboratories for testing.
So basically, with MBR Acres, they breed up to 2,000 beagle puppies, and at 20 weeks old, they get sent to various laboratories, so they undergo horrific toxicology experiments. These toxicology experiments involve a procedure called oral gavage, and that is basically putting a tube down a dog's throat without any anaesthetic, no painkillers whatsoever, which will contain the chemicals and the poisons, and that goes into the little dog's stomachs. The result of those experiments is they go through horrific suffering, convulsing, throwing up blood, and these experiments can go on for 90 days. After the 90 days, they then get killed and then dissected so they can check out their organs and things.
And one of the shocking things we found out recently that happens in there, which has been discovered from Freedom of Information requests, is exsanguination, which is a new word for a lot of us. Exsanguination means literally bleeding to death. So that's what they will do to the dogs, because the scientists in the labs, they will want blood samples to make blood products, to use plasma and to actually physically make blood products, and also to actually do experiments and tests on bloods. So they will. Some of the dogs will be used for regular, like, blood donoring. So they'll take a small sample of blood from some of the dogs, but some of the dogs, they will just bleed them to death.
Even though it's heavily redacted, you can see that their Home Office licence permits the facility to bleed the beagles under terminal anaesthetic in order to sell the dog's blood to customers as bioproduct. The document says that More than 85% of the animals used under this licence will be kept under general anaesthesia throughout the sampling procedures and will not be brought back to consciousness. They'll be humanely killed while still under anaesthesia with an overdose of anaesthetic. Therefore, these animals are not expected nor likely to experience any adverse effects. The camp still claim that the dogs are not put under anaesthetic before being terminally bled, despite what it says in the project licence. But learning about the bleeding that goes on in the facility certainly seems to have strengthened the protesters' enthusiasm to shut down MBR. When will it end?
Tomorrow.
Tomorrow, hopefully, yeah. I mean, we're here till we've got the job done, basically. We're going nowhere. Despite what MBR are trying to throw at us with all their legal crap, we will close them down. And I believe it's this year that place is going to go, for sure.
One of the camp's central claims is that the general welfare of the animals is poor, and the MBR acres are not meeting the welfare standards set out by the Home Office. Concern increased when they obtained the first ever covert footage from inside the facility. They're also looking to prove that the Beagles are mistreated through surveillance tactics. I meet the camp's resident drone pilot, Luna, to find out more.
So obviously, you know, this is the surveillance stuff that it's a vital point in collecting the evidence that we need to try and get MBR shut down. So this is the DJI drone that we've got.
What has Camp Beagle captured on this drone that would indicate wrongdoing?
Can't say too much because it's all sort of gathering evidence, so that it's not really something that can be made public until we've finished our job, which is shutting them down, sort of thing. So yeah.
I'm disappointed that I'm not allowed to see the footage Luna claims exposes MBR breaking welfare standards, but I can see the other footage taken on their drone that the camp post on their Instagram page. The drone captures the Beagles being transported in groups around MBR acres in metal trolleys. When the time comes for them to be sold to animal testing laboratories, the puppies are packed into smaller plastic crates. These are then loaded into vans, which will take them from the facility permanently. Their online presence is quickly becoming their most successful method of protesting. Having amassed thousands of followers, Camp Beagle has now attracted a host of celebrity endorsements. And before the injunction was in place, singer-songwriter Will Young even handcuffed himself to the front gates of MBR Acres in solidarity with the camp. This publicity has resulted in the camp rapidly attracting new supporters, so much so that the police have had to escort the vans which transport puppies off-site, and a Freedom of Information request revealed that Cambridgeshire Police have spent over £350,000 in policing the camp so far. After speaking with Luna, I met back up with John. He wants to show me a bit more of the camp and the best views of the facility. He tells me that the camp faced closure after MBR Acres sought an injunction against the camp last year. John shows me a board which lists the members of the camp who are not allowed to enter or protest within 20 metres of the facility's entrance.
Right, okay. So is there a file here on you?
Yeah, I'm a named person.
Okay. Right.
John wants to get me a closer look at the facility without breaking the injunction. I'm guided over a makeshift bridge and through some woodland until I'm right up against the perimeter fence of MBR Acres.
So the dogs are going to be taken from those sort of huts and then put in a lorry and then driven off?
That's what this company is here to do, to breed beagle puppies for toxicology experiments on dogs. The reason they use beagles is they're so compliant to other dogs. Imagine trying to take 9 blood tests from a dog every day, you know?
Yeah.
Most dogs are going to be biting, and beagles will freeze, you know, they're used for that temperament.
One of the saddest things of all is this is the best it will ever get for them. You know, this is the best it'll ever be, because here it's awful, it's a prison, but when they leave here, it gets even worse. They have up to 90 days of being, like John said earlier, having blood taken X amount of times a day, being fed toxins constantly, you know, and you just think, if this is as good as life ever gets, what is that?
To me, the razor wires, It sums this place up, really.
Yeah, what is that keeping people in, or what's it keeping out?
The truth, you know. The whole thing of the vivisection industry is based on secrecy, absolutely based on secrecy.
The dog's barking is loud and it's continuous. But I'm told that the barking is far louder when the staff arrive for their shifts.
But someone said to me the other day, like, what is that sound? And she said, it was so simple, she's got beagles. And she said, it's just the sound of puppies crying for their mothers. You know, it's like, remember that these dogs will never get exercise, never stretch their legs, never see the sky, never see a blade of grass.
Are they kept with their parents, or?
No, moved away.
This isn't the first time that MBR Acres have been accused of mistreating their beagles. In June 2020, this footage was leaked and published by The Mirror, which shows the dogs being transported from the sheds, where they are held, to the vans that take them off-site. The sound of the dogs loudly barking, and the way in which they were being loaded into the trolley, led to public outcry. The Mirror newspaper published this footage as part of an expose into MBR Acres. As a result, the Home Office decided to conduct an unannounced inspection of the facility. But the Home Office investigation said that no animal welfare standards had been breached, and they found the dogs to be bright, alert and responsive, standing at the front of their cages, wagging their tails. The reason why the Home Office were the people conducting this investigation is because they're in charge of regulating the animal testing industry in the UK. This is because of legislation called ASPR, the Animal Scientific Procedures Act, which was written in 1986. MBR beagles are amongst some of the species that are protected by ASPR, and even though they're not being tested on in the MBR Acres facility, they're still protected by the Act. So this is a copy of the Home Office inspection plan and report from when they visited MBR Acres. And what it says is that one of the main specific areas of concern relating to public interest was regarding transport off-site. That's because of the mirror footage that was released of the dogs. And it says that they checked some of the elements of transport. The crates were inspected, they were clean, the staff were trained to handle them correctly, but it also notes although no animals were being transported off-site on the day of the inspection. So it's slightly unclear how they managed to brand it compliant when they weren't able to check in person the exact thing that instigated the investigation. I asked the Home Office how they could be sure that MBR Acres were following the rules if they weren't able to witness some of the key procedures which had sparked their inspection in the first place. They responded by writing, "The Animals and Science Regulation Unit have conducted 10 on-site inspections, 5 of which were unannounced. All aspects assessed on each inspection were compliant with the Animal Scientific Procedures Act, licence conditions and the Code of Practice for housing and care of animals bred, supplied or used for scientific purposes." But having read the Home Office's investigation report and MBR Acres' facilities licence, which outlines which procedures are carried out there, I wanted to find out more about why they're carried out in the first place. So I'm meeting Chris McGee from Understanding Animal Research, which is a non-profit organisation representing many groups, including Marshall Bioresources. Could you explain what exsanguination means and why it's used?
So blood products can be used to create medicines, and in terms of dog's blood, dog medicines. You can use the platelets to make arthritis drugs, for instance, and so MBR have a licence for bleeding under terminal anaesthesia, which means that the animal is killed under anaesthesia and bled that way. They don't die as a result of the bleeding.
Talk to me a bit more about that Home Office inspection that happened, because it's something that we didn't hear from Camp Beagle at all. There was no mention of it. What happened and why did it happen? They
did an unannounced inspection and then they released the results, and it showed nothing but healthy and happy dogs. It showed that what they called a cold concrete floor actually has underfloor heating, and where the underfloor heating wasn't working they had a heat lamp. It showed toys in every pen, it showed exercise facilities inside, and it had a lot of details which directly contradicted the idea of a cold, dark space, which is what the camp had started out claiming. None of their claims are true.
Do you think Camp Beagle, what odds do you give them of winning in terms of in their aim to shut down MBR Acres?
0. There's no chance. I mean, if they were successful, they'd have to fly animals in from abroad or simply move the facility. And I can't see how that's a win for animal welfare at all.
The camp doesn't just say that the animals will suffer in MBR Acres. They also say the dogs will go on to live lives of immense suffering beyond the breeding facility when they're tested on in labs and universities.
Why are dogs used in testing?
Dogs are used for regulatory toxicology, which means usually a repeat dose toxicity test, which is a small amount of a compound, not enough to sicken the dog, is given to them every day for a couple of months. Then they're humanely euthanized and their organs are examined for signs of pathology that hasn't yet become disease. They're not a very common, relatively speaking, research animal, but they still remain the best predictor of safety of any other species, including primates. So they're used in limited numbers to test that things are safe.
Obviously, the camp claim there's huge amounts of suffering happening within these facilities and in animal testing later down the line. What sort of evidence can you point to suggest that isn't happening, or contextualise what that suffering is?
Every experiment's licensed on its own merits of the harms versus the benefits, and those would be very different in each case. However, there are categories of suffering. You have severe, which is as bad as it sounds. It could be acute pain for a short amount of time, or moderate pain for a longer amount of time. Moderate would be something that would imply surgery under general anaesthetic, followed by recovery. And mild is the introduction of a needle, so something like a blood test, that kind of thing. There is a non-recovery one, which is where things happen under terminal anaesthetic, so the animal never wakes up again. And there is a sub-mild category, a sub-threshold category, which is milder than mild.
The Home Office record the severity of each experiment involving animals. In the most recent year of data, there were 4,340 experiments which used dogs. 75% of these experiments were classed as mild severity. 23% of experiments were more severe and fell into the moderate category. 9 experiments resulted in the most extreme rating, severe, and there were an additional 65 cases where the dogs did not recover from the experiments at all. Scientists like Dr. Andre Monash also believe that animal testing causes huge amounts of suffering, but he thinks it should end primarily because it doesn't work.
I think there is overwhelming scientific evidence that animal models are simply not relevant to human health. There's simply too many species differences between us and them. And animal models have never been validated in the sense that they've never been approved as predictive of human outcome when we test drugs or we want to study human disease.
So what are the non-animal alternative methods?
I'm not going to tell the pharmaceutical industry how to replace the animal tests. The technology is out there, it's available today, and yet industry continues to ignore this modern technology such as organ on a chip, way better, far more predictive than animal testing. I'm not going to say it's 100% perfect because it's not, but if we're talking 80% prediction, that is way better than the animal model, which is less than 50% predictive.
If Dr. Monash is right about the alternatives to animal testing, then research groups that continue to use animals are breaching a requirement of the Animal Scientific Procedures Act 1986, specifically the section known as the 3 Rs. The first of the 3 Rs is reduction. That's the principle that where protected species are used, the number of those animals is reduced to a minimum. The second is refinement, which is saying that when animals are used in testing, the suffering that they endure during the tests should also be reduced to a minimum. Lastly, there's the principle of replacement, which says that animal testing should only be used as a last resort, and that when non-animal methods exist which also work, they should be used instead. That's the principle that probably causes the most controversy amongst animal rights activists, because they follow people like Dr. Andre Monash in saying that these other non-animal methods exist and they're just as good, but they're just not being used yet. This last principle causes most controversy amongst animal rights groups, as many follow Dr. Monash in arguing that alternatives to animal testing are available, but they just aren't being used. Facilities like MBR Acres have to prove that they have followed the 3 Rs as they carry out bleeding under terminal anaesthesia in the facility, which is seen as a scientific procedure. MBR justify their use of exsanguination against the replacement principle by saying, there are a number of promising technologies, however these in vitro approaches do not yet offer an alternative to totally replace the need for research animals. I'm going to speak to the National Centre for the 3 Rs to see what they had to say in response to Dr. Andre Monash's claim that there are better alternatives to animal testing.
You have sort of anti-viv organisations that might tend to sort of over-exaggerate the effectiveness of animal models and where they can be used. And we know that there are some great methods out there. And I think the reality is that we're not quite there yet and able to replace animal use completely. But we are at the NC3R is looking to promote the best science and to find ways to replace animals where they can safely be used without compromising safety to the environment and to humans as well. One of the projects that we're funding at the moment, and we've put over £2.5 million behind this project, is to develop a virtual dog. So we are working with industry and academics in a challenge which is aiming to develop a suite of virtual dog tissues and organs to simulate the situation in the dog.
Even if the NC3Rs find viable non-animal alternatives, animal testing won't be phased out until the laws change. The current UK legislation requires that new chemical substances are tested on at least 2 animal species, a rodent and a non-rodent. So politicians like the Green Party MP, Caroline Lucas, have voted in support of an independent review of animal testing. She hopes it would prove that using animals as predictive models for humans is outdated. 109 MPs from across Parliament joined her in supporting this proposal.
So Early Day Motion 175 is essentially an attempt within Parliament to rally as many MPs as possible behind the idea that we should have a review into whether or not animal testing is actually giving us good information about the kinds of implications for human beings. And that's so important because there is so much evidence out there that animal testing not only is not effective as a predictor of whether or not a particular medicine, let's say, is going to be useful on human beings. There's plenty of evidence to suggest it set back progress in this area.
Camp Beagle's grassroots campaign may seem to be a world away from the corridors of Westminster, but that hasn't stopped them from receiving support from some of the largest animal rights groups in the world. I'm meeting a spokesperson for PETA. They publicly endorsed the camp and donated many of the placards which surround the entrance of MBR Acres. I start by asking for her thoughts on the Home Office investigation, which found no welfare issues.
There's actually footage out there, and you can see the footage of the beagles in this facility. And if you've seen this footage, you would not be agreeing that these dogs are happy and healthy. They are crying so loudly that it's painful for the people listening to the video, let alone the dogs in MBR Acres. And I don't think any animal or human could, nobody could agree that these dogs are happy when they're in a windowless prison. It's loud and excessive noise and excessive light, so they struggle to sleep, eating the same food day in, day out. The mothers at MBR Acres are forced to repeatedly churn out puppies by force. I think they were reportedly forced to churn out around 2,000 puppies a year until their bodies are spent and exhausted, at which case they're just disposed of. And then their puppies are transported to labs where they're forced to undergo painful experiments.
Part of Camp Beagle's activism is to heckle employees as they come into work. What do you make of their more controversial protest methods?
Obviously, a lot of methods of protesting are often very extreme, but the one key thing to remember is that nobody would be talking about MBR Acres right now. Nobody would be listening or even know that that facility is there had these protests and these sort of different ideas and demos that people are doing. If they hadn't done them in the first place, people wouldn't be talking about the issue. So it's achieved one thing, and that's discussion.
I want to see Camp Beagle's more controversial protest methods firsthand, so I'm going back to see how they interact with the workers coming in for their shifts.
Dirty people, dirty, dirty people, dirty, dirty people. There's no need to work for a company that kills dogs, kills puppies. It's not even about that. The fact that they don't even get decent life up until you send them to be killed is fucking animal welfare. That's what we're looking at now. Keeping rats open all night. We're going to speak first. They think it's okay to keep puppies in that condition. Fucking scumbags.
The campers then make their way down to the side of the facility to shout at the workers directly.
A man with no conscience is no man at all. A man with no conscience is no man at all.
A man with no conscience.
No man at all.
No man at all.
A man with no conscience
no man at all.
The sound of the dogs clearly impacts the activists profoundly. Now I'm back at camp, I want to take the opportunity to meet some more of the activists. Carol was shielding during the COVID pandemic, since she suffers from several medical conditions which have reduced her lung capacity to 20%. Over the winter, she was confined to her van and even wore nappies since she couldn't risk the icy walk to the Portaloo.
Bless you.
I have no reason to go home. I've got my hospital here now, I've got my doctor, I've got best friends. I've waited 40 odd years for them. Yeah, it's fantastic.
So you won't leave?
No, my aim is to try my best, obviously, get them closed down. You find this unconditional love with dogs you don't even know. And that's what I've found, you know. Just plod on for them, doesn't matter. It doesn't even matter one day if I don't even, you know, survive it. But I know I'll, you know, it sounds awful, but I'll have died for something I want to do, and for something I love, you know, it's a passion, like. So, yeah. And I can move on and go back to my old life. It was fantastic. I was working abroad and everything, it was brilliant. But, you know, money's not everything. It wasn't, you know, it's from here with me. And I've waited a long time to get it right. And this is what I'm doing, yeah.
Thank you so much.
I'm still missing an insight into what motivates people to give up their normal lives. So I've decided to set up a tent and spend the night at Camp Beagle, something they welcome anyone to do. As day turns to night, the camp is lit up, and before bed, I'm invited to sit with the activists around the campfire.
Woke up this morning, smile with the rising sun. 3 little birds upon my doorstep.
The next morning, I'm joining Camp Beagle to experience one of their most important methods of protesting, outreach events.
We will end this, and we will close MBR acres.
The event starts in a park in Cambridge, as attended by animal rights activists from all over the country. They start processing through the town and handing out leaflets to the public. In the city centre, the marchers paused to listen to John.
Here, there's hundreds of us, in a few hundreds, but there's salt to the earth people. There's people here that go back decades and decades, and we're not going to give up. And I can sense something in the air. You can sense it at Camp Beagle on a daily basis.
We've already got the laws in place that say that you have to use an alternative if it exists. We're already trying to find the alternative. Join that fight. Help us move away from this.
This time round, we are not going to give up. Let me tell you.
Peter completely agree and back Camp Beagle. MBR acres need to be shut down. They need to stop providing animals to an awful industry.
When we say we're going to free the MBR Beagles, when we say we're not going to leave until we free them, we ain't talking empty talk. People didn't spend the entire winter there.
just for propaganda. We mean it. And when they took those dogs out on Thursday, it kills us.
The regulations that we're working with at the moment were developed decades ago based on the scientific understanding at the time, and we now have a huge amount of information and new scientific developments that we can utilise, and it is time to rethink how we do things and think actually what is the best way of making these assessments based on the scientific knowledge that we have now.
Never give up. Listen, we've got a fucking crank that's smashed down the walls, either figuratively, really, however we're going to do it. Smash down the walls.